Well, welcome to what is, I think, the sixth or seventh or something like that. Welcome to the umpteenth in a long series now of our CEPR seminar series. My name is Heather Boucher, and I'm an economist here at CEPR, and I'm giving tonight's talk, which I've entitled Horatio Alger is Dead. I want to take this moment to remind you to turn your cell phones off. And there we go. And to also thank you all for coming. And those of you listening on iPod casts and the like. So the focus of tonight's talk is on economic mobility and what's been happening in terms of whether or not families and individuals are able to move up the economic ladder. A couple of weeks ago, I guess 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, John Schmidt gave a talk on what was going on in the U.S. labor market and the economy more generally in terms of inequality, income inequality, wage inequality, and wealth inequality. And I want to touch on a lot of those topics tonight in terms of whether or not that inequality in the labor market is translated into people not being able to move up the ladder. Now, I titled the talk, Horatio Alger is Dead, because a lot of times when we talk about mobility, we tend to think of the United States as this highly mobile society, and that's epitomized by these stories that are written by Horatio Alger, sort of this bootstraps thing that we've got going on here in the United States, that anybody can come here and can move up the ladder and become richer than their parents were. And so I decided to show you, and many of you I know have the handouts here, and there we go, a picture of Horatio Alger, just to start things off. And I did a little bit of research looking into who he was, because I thought that might be interesting. Mr. Alger wrote in the late 1800s in the United States, and he produced one of the first boys' adventure series. And they were all about boys, sometimes orphans, sometimes not, sort of moving up. But one thing that I thought was of note, there were a couple things of note that I thought as I was looking into this. Most of the boys who were able to move up and become successful in his stories were actually helped out by a mentor or a rich friend. And so even this notion that Horatio Alger are these sort of bootstrap stories really does belie the reality that very few people get ahead without some sort of luck or something kind of helping them along. So I thought that would be a nice way to start, because I think that is a lot of what we see here in the U.S. labor market today. So after John Schmidt's talk that happened a few weeks ago, I think if I were to have just sort of heard that without any introduction to what was happening in the U.S. economy, if you knew that there was a high degree of inequity in the United States, one obvious question that people might ask is, well, so what? Why does that matter? People start off when they start in the labor market at the bottom end of the distribution, or new immigrants come here and then are able to kind of work their way up. So maybe, in a sense, inequality isn't inherently a bad thing. It's just where people start, and that the inequality is that it's people starting off in the labor market at the bottom, but by the end of their lives, they've moved up to the top. That's sort of one big criticism that we've seen, especially in the econ literature. And maybe I'm just revealing the way economists think. Maybe none of you actually had this question. But economists have tended to question whether or not inequality is bad by looking at this question of mobility. Because if people are moving up, then inequality in itself may not be such a bad thing. Well, what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is that in reality, in the United States, we've actually seen a decline in economic mobility as we've seen inequality rising. So as we've seen the dispersion, that is the gap in earnings between the rich and the poor among us, we've also seen that it's harder for those who start at the bottom to move their way up, and that it's more likely for those who start at the top to stay there. I'm sure we can all think of many good examples of folks who start at the top and who get to stay there, the sort of silver spoon thing. But it's also really a lot of the second or third part of the talk I'm going to do tonight is going to focus on folks at the bottom and whether or not they're able to move up, and how that's become increasingly difficult in the United States. Now, this talk is going to be a little bit more complicated than the one I gave last week. Mobility is it's much harder to measure than just simple labor supply patterns. And there's going to be a lot more data and a lot more tables and charts. And so you're going to have to bear with me, and hopefully they will all be clear. If you have any questions that are specific to the data I'm going to show, feel free to ask those as I'm going along. But then other substantive questions would be better if you guys could wait to the end. The basic structure of the talk I'm going to give tonight is I'm going to go over what economic mobility is, how we measure it, how we talk about it, and show you a bunch of statistics on it, a lot more than I showed last week. But I think it's important because, well, I'll go into why it's important as I talk about it, but it's critical that you get this from a number of different sources because it is so hard to measure, and one study alone really wouldn't give you the full story of what's been going on with mobility. I'm going to talk about mobility, especially with respect to folks moving up from the bottom. There's two different ways that we can look at it, absolute or relative mobility, and I'll go into what that means, but especially looking, sort of taking an absolute measure of people moving out of poverty, whether that's more or less likely today than it was a few years ago. And then I'm going to compare what's gone on here in the United States with what's gone on abroad. The United States has much more both wage and income inequality than other advanced economies, and it is also the case that we're less mobile. And I want to give you some facts to arm yourself with that. And then we'll talk about the reasons why this has happened. And many of the answers are going to be the same answers for why we see an increase in economic inequality overall. So to start off, I want to focus in on the fact that economic mobility is not the same as economic inequality. So to just kind of recap a little bit what John talked about and what I touched on last week, when we talk about economic inequality, we're looking at a snapshot, at a moment in time. So if we were to, take all of you and everybody were to write down how much income they had and what their wages were, we would get a sense of the dispersion of wages and income of the people in this room, and that it would be representative of some particular kind of person in Washington, D.C., right? And that would be a snapshot of what the level of inequality is right now. But mobility is different, and to touch on that just a little bit more, we could measure that by just asking you all questions about your income and wages today. We don't need to do anything necessarily fancy. We can just do a survey at just one moment in time. That is different than mobility, where we need to say, okay, well, based on where you were 15 years ago, where are you now? And how does the trajectory that any one individual in this room has experienced differ from everyone else and from other kinds of people here in the United States? So it's a very different question. You want to follow people's income or their well-being over time, which poses much more difficult measurement problems and data problems, because I can't just go out and ask everybody today. If I want to know whether or not mobility has changed over the past 40 years, I need to have data that goes back 40 years. And we know that you need to have started 40 years ago. So people needed to have that question a long time ago in order to get good answers today. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about the data, but it's just really important to have in your head that there's a really big distinction between these two concepts, but they're related in how people move through time and people's opportunities. For example, if there's a high degree of wealth inequality in this country, then children who are born into families of less wealth may be less likely to go to good colleges, which then may be less likely to put them on the road to having good jobs. So that the level of inequality at a moment in time can have an impact on mobility over time. But they're two distinct things, and it's not necessarily that one moves in tandem with the other. So to kind of go back a little bit over what we've learned before, I want to show you this chart that is from John's talk from a few weeks ago, which just looks at the annual growth in real family income in the United States, comparing two time periods. And the first set of the bars, and I think actually John might have shown it slightly differently, but it's the same data. This shows how family income grew between 1947 and 1979. And you can see that families across the income distribution, families in the bottom 20th percentile and families in the top 5th percentile, all saw their incomes rise around 2.4% over that annually over that time period. So each year people were seeing a real, that is after inflation, increase in their income about 2.4%. That's very different than what we saw in the period from 79 to 2002, and we have updated numbers through 2004, but I didn't update my chart, which shows that families in the bottom saw an annual increase of only 0.2% in inflation-adjusted terms in their income over time, whereas families at the top, in the top 5%, saw a 1.5 increase in their income annually. So over this time period, in the post-1970s time period, you saw an increase in the dispersion, that folks at the bottom were not getting as rich and folks at the top were getting a lot richer. So this, just to kind of go back to focus on inequality for a moment, this is what inequality looks like in the United States. Right? If we were to take a snapshot and look at how the growth in inequality has looked at over time, which is again different from what we're going to talk about today, which is mobility. But I think it's important to kind of have these two concepts really clear in your head and to understand that that inequality has been increasing over time here in the United States. So one of the things as we sort of move into wanting to think about economic mobility is that, again, you have to look at people at two moments in time, right? If we want to look at inequality, we can just survey individuals now. But if you want to know something about mobility, and especially if you want to know whether or not things have changed since the 1970s, you have to know where people started off in the 1970s and then where they ended up. So I have a graphic here that hopefully will illuminate how to think about this. One way of thinking about mobility, and here I'm going to use the term relative mobility. There's two ways of thinking about the mobility question. One is relative, where we look at people, how they compare to other folks that look like them or maybe don't look like them. That would be to sort of take all of us in this room and say, okay, compared to 10 years ago, how much better off are you now than you were 10 years ago? And how does that compare to how other people progressed, right? A lot of folks in this room are relatively young, so maybe a lot of folks were still in school 10 years ago. But if everybody was sort of at the same place and has been kind of moving along the same pace, then there would be, that's what we could think of as relative mobility. Versus a concept that I'll talk about later on, which is absolute mobility, where you kind of draw a line in the sand and say how many people have moved beyond this threshold, or were able to move out of one state into another, where you're kind of setting a firm statement of how you think people should progress. So they're two very different concepts. Most of the talk I'm going to talk about relative, and we'll get to the absolute in a minute. Does that make sense to folks? Or okay, good. I'm seeing a lot of puzzled looks. So here, when we're thinking about relative mobility, on the left-hand side here, we're looking at the income or wage quantile, whatever it is that you want to measure, at the beginning of the time periods. And then across the columns, we're looking at where folks end up, their quantile at the end of the period. So you're saying, okay, folks who began in the bottom 20%, what share of them end up in the bottom 20%? And these blue squares here are folks that are stayers. They're people who start in one quantile and they end in the same place where they began. So that is that when you look at the whole distribution of people in 1 year, say 1980, you're standing right there in the middle of the income distribution, and then fast forward to 2005, and lo and behold, you're still in the middle of the income distribution, then you would be in this blue box right here. Then I'm going to move on to fancy graphic, number one. These yellow and pink squares up here are people that have moved up. And the yellow is the folks, I think that is yellow, these are folks who've moved from the bottom into somewhere closer to a little bit less than the bottom. So folks that started off in the bottom but that ended up in the second or middle quintile here in yellow, folks that started off in the second quintile and that ended up in the middle are sort of here. And then these pink folks are folks that started off very low but ended off very high. So these are sort of real strivers, or people that have really sort of made something of themselves, right? They started off at the bottom quintile, they were poor at the very beginning in 1980, but then fast forward to 2005, and all of a sudden they're at the top of the income distribution. These are sort of what we typically think about as the Horatio Algers, right? The folks that were able to make it. And last, these folks down here in red are the people who fell. These are folks who started off in the top and then ended up in the bottom or second quintile, or started off in these quintiles and fell down. So these are folks that have actually experienced a decline in their incomes over time. And these green folks are folks that stayed about the same but got, fell a little bit but didn't fall so far. So having gone over that, I'm going to show you a couple of charts. I think something very bad has happened up here, which is that I think my numbers, sorry. I think my charts just got out of order, which I think is going to mess up what's happening to me next. No, I'm okay. All right, just me. I'm just out of order. All right. Sorry, you can delete that from the iPod version. It's very embarrassing. I listened to the iPod the other night. It's very embarrassing, these little sort of things that aren't so bad in person, but it's not so good on the thing. At any rate, what? Excellent. Well, I appreciate that. But okay, so before we move on to sort of showing this in a table, I wanted to go over a few sort of sets of facts, of things that we know, what the research has told us about economic mobility in the United States. But I want to give a little bit of a hypothetical example, which is in the handout, to kind of help make this real, so you kind of get a sense of what this means. And so the example that I just sort of threw into the notes there is that, let's say that we got two people, Mark and Peter, who are the same age and they're both college graduates. And in 1989, when they graduated, about 5 years after graduation, both of them had family income that was $44,000 a year in inflation-adjusted terms, so in today's dollars, which if you were to go to the Census Bureau and look at the charts, you would find that would put them right smack in the middle quintile. So they're in this row right here. They both started off right in the middle of the family income distribution, right actually at the median. Now, if you fast forward to 2005, so 26 years later, Mark's family income was $70,000 and Peter's was $54,000. So they've both seen an increase in their income over time. They've actually seen, quite healthy growth. They're both making relatively good incomes. But if we were to sort of place them here on this chart, we would put Mark up here in the fourth quintile because he actually moved up. He went from $44,000 to $70,000, which is not only an increase in income, but he was able to transcend his quintile. And and so he's a striver, and we'll put him up here in the purple zone. So he's moved up, and he's moved up relative to where he started. He started in the middle, but now he's above the middle. So he's better off relative to everybody he knows. Whereas Peter, who actually also saw an increase in his income, only saw an increase of $10,000. It was $54,000. But given the fact that incomes rise over time, which is kind of why I showed that chart that John had showed before, that on average folks in the middle saw an increase of income of something over time, not 2.4, 1 point something. Folks in the middle between 7902 saw 0.6% annual increase in income after inflation. Because people's incomes do increase, Peter at $54,000 a year stayed in the middle because everybody else saw their incomes rise as well. So that's what I mean by relative, that even though both Mark and Peter saw an increase in their incomes, one of them actually moved up into a higher place in the income distribution. One of them kind of stayed exactly where he was, although he was slightly better off. But relative to all of his friends, he wasn't really better off at all. So that's just to kind of give you an example to kind of make this real, this sort of complicated color chart up here. What has been happening in the United States, however, over the past 20 or 30, 40 years, 30 years, has been that people are actually less likely to move up. So that it's harder for people who start at the bottom to move up, and folks that start at the top are more likely to stay there. So this notion of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer is consistent across time, not only just when we look at it cross-sectionally at one point in time. So to just throw some statistics at you from the number of studies, there was a very interesting recent study that was done that looked at sons of fathers, and found that sons of fathers in the bottom quintile, defined not only by income but also by a host of other socioeconomic factors like education and the father's occupation. So boys who started off, only 10% of those who'd started off by 1998 were actually in the top quintile. Top quintile, yes. But the previous generation of sons, the ones who came of age or in the early 1970s, nearly a quarter of them had moved from the bottom to the top. So when we're looking over the period from the 1950s to the early 1970s, about a quarter of young men who started in the bottom made it to the top. But when you look at the period after the 1970s, as inequality was rising, only 1 in 10 made it from the bottom up into the top. So, at least among young men in this one study, they found that there was a lower likelihood of men moving up over time. I'm going to show you a chart from some work done by a woman named Jo Blandon and her colleague Machin. I don't know that person's first name. That sort of takes another slice, and again, this is actually also looking at sons in the bottom 25 percentile. It's not the same research, it's not the same data, but showing that men who start off in the bottom 25th percentile in the 50s to the 80s, 41% of them were still in the bottom 25% at the end of that time period. Whereas when you look from the 60s to the late 1990s, more of them were still in the bottom. So 44% were still in the bottom. And when you look at the richest men, fewer of them. I'm sorry, did I get that wrong? Bottom income level. Yeah, I think that's. I'm sorry? Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. No, I just was having a moment of complete number dyslexia up here. So, you know what? I'm just going to skip this one. I'm going to come back to it when I feel a little more ready for it. Okay. So we'll go to the table. Sorry about that. So I want to go over this table, and I want to spend a little bit of time on it and the next two. And these are both from the same study done by Jane Bradbury and Katz, who are at the Federal Reserve Board in Boston. And what they've done is they've used a panel study in the United States called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics, which was started in the late 1960s, in 1968. And it started with 5,000 families. And they've been interviewing these people every year since then. In 1998, they had a crisis in funding, and so some of the questions were cut, and they've started doing the interviews every other year, and things have gotten a little confusing since then. But it's been a wonderful resource for people who want to look at mobility, and it's quite frankly one of the only nationally available data sets here in the United States that you can use to really answer detailed questions about economic mobility over time. But to kind of get back to this data issue, I mean, they started with these 5,000 people, and then they have to go back and interview them, and these interviews are quite extensive. They take a lot of time, and so it's actually quite a big commitment on the part of the families, and they followed their children, and as families have separated and moved, they followed them over time. So they're quite expensive, and if you stop doing the survey for 1 year or 2 years, you're not going to be able to do the kind of analysis that you want to do. So it really is much more of an investment to study mobility than it is to study inequality, which I think is, it's important to note that that's why we don't know that much about it, because it is so complicated to do. But they have done some of the best work on this. They've done a couple of papers that have come out in the past couple of years. And I want to go over their findings from their 2002 paper. So this first chart looks at relative income mobility between 69 and 79. So it takes the first year of the panel and looks through 1979 when inequality started rising and says, okay, folks who started off in the bottom, 49.4% of them ended up at the bottom. Among folks who started in the second quintile, 27.8% ended up in the second quintile. Now, one thing that's important to note about this particular kind of analysis is that we're truncating people at the bottom, at the very bottom and the very top. These folks who started off at the bottom had nowhere left to fall. And so this relatively high share of them who stayed there has something to do with the fact that we can't measure their falling below zero because it's impossible for them to go any further than where they started when you're doing this kind of quintile analysis. And similarly for folks at the very top, those who started off in the top quintile, they can't go any higher. So it creates this somewhat of an oddity here in the data. But having said that, I put these little guys in orange here to just sort of point them out. So here we have 27.8% of folks who start in the second quintile ending up there, and 23.7% who start in the top quintile ending up in the fourth quintile. That is, they fell down a quintile. It's somewhat interesting to note that if we had complete if it was random, if economic mobility was random, where someone ended up in 1979 had nothing to do with where they started in 1969, then each of these little boxes would have would be 20%, or somewhat akin to 20%, if there was no what we economists might call path dependency based on where you started and where you ended up. But that, of course, is not the case. You see that over time, some of the largest boxes are people starting and ending right where they started. And then as you move further up, fewer and fewer people sort of get farther from where they began. I want to move to the next chart, which shows the same kind of analysis for the 1990s, from 88 to 98. And so I've highlighted these same boxes here to sort of go back. Folks in the second quintile who ended up in the second quintile, we see that 36.3% of folks stayed where they were if they started in the second quintile. That's much higher than the 27.8% that occurred in the earlier period. And then up here, the 23.2 is about the same as what we saw in the earlier period. And to make that a little bit easier to think about, I put these on the same table, which we don't typically do. But so again, here we have the quintile at the beginning of the period, and then we have where folks at the bottom ended up in the two periods, 69-79 and 88-98, and then folks who started off where they start off and where they who ended up in the top. And what you can see is that folks were more likely to end up in the bottom if they started off in the bottom in the later period compared to the earlier period. So just looking at folks who started off in the bottom quintile, 49.4% started off in the bottom and ended in the bottom in the earlier period versus 53.3%. So it's a relatively significant jump. It's about as big as the jump at the top. So 49.1% who started at the top stayed at the top in the early period versus 53.2%. So both at the top and the bottom, folks were more likely to stay where they started in the second period. You also, just sort of looking down the chart here, folks who started off in the second were more likely to fall in the second period, and they were less likely to make their way all the way to the top. And among those who started in the bottom, they're actually slightly more likely to make it to the top, but then less likely to the folks in the second, middle, and fourth, second and middle, were less likely to make it into the top in the second period. So these are all indications of a greater amount of stasis in the labor market, that it was harder for people to move up in the 1990s than it was in the 1970s, before inequality started to increase. One of the things that I talked about a lot during the last session was the importance of wives' contributions to family income and how important that's been for economic mobility. And what, and again, it's research done by Bradbury and Katz, who are the same people who did this work. What they found is that where families where wives had high and rising employment rates, work hours, and pay were more likely to move up the income ladder or maintain their position rather than fall down. So wives' contributions were critical for families. These families that were more likely to move up were also more likely to have wives that were working and experiencing real wage growth. But it is important to note that even with the significant and large increase in the labor force participation of wives, it's not been enough to counterbalance the decrease in mobility that we've seen over here at the bottom end. And I put a copy of the income growth by married couple families with children in the presentation and in the handouts, which I went over last week, so we don't need to go over again, but I think it's useful when we're thinking about this contribution of wives. I'm going to skip it for right now. So going back to this research that I just mentioned about Bradbury and Katz, looking at the contribution of wives, families in which the wife was working in both 69 and 79 are over here in this left-hand column, and families where the wife was not working is in the right-hand column. And then these colors indicate the families that either moved up or stay where they were in that box that I showed you with the fancy graphics. And this red line, which is at about 50%, shows that among families with the wife working, about 50% moved up in some way. Either they stayed at the top or they moved up 1 or 2 quintiles, which is more than families where the wife wasn't working, which is sort of the top, this gray bit right here, which was about 45%. So wives' contributions were critical for families that moved up. When we in the early period. And then when we look at the later period, I think what's really quite interesting here is that the share of families where who moved up at all is much less, even if the wife was working. About 44% of families actually moved up or stayed at the top in the later period, even with the wife working, but that the fall was greater for families where the wife wasn't working. Which doesn't mean that wives were the only thing that had to do with wives working wasn't the only contribution to economic mobility. It's not sufficient for families to move up, but it certainly has had an effect on whether or not families have moved up, even though it's been harder for all families to move up in the second period. So I want to move now to talking about issues of absolute economic mobility. And again, what I mean by that is sort of drawing a line in the sand and seeing how many families move above it. And in particular, what I'm going to look at is moving in and out of poverty. And the way that poverty is defined in this chart is as 50% of median income or earnings. I think it's income. I actually, quite frankly, don't remember. We can look it up if anyone has questions. In each of these countries. Part of the reason that we don't use the official poverty threshold when comparing analysis across countries is, of course, every country has their own thresholds, and ours is somewhat idiosyncratic, and to have a consistent way of looking at poverty across countries, generally what researchers do is look at about 50% of median earnings or income, because that gives you a sense of how many folks are at the bottom. So what this chart shows is just how limited the mobility out of poverty is in the United States, especially vis-a-vis other countries. So we're kind of getting at both concepts at once. When you look at this first column of folks who are poor at least once, you see that the United States is near the top, 23.5% over a three. It's a series of panel studies where they're looking over a 3-year period in each country, slightly different years, but all at about the same time in the mid to late 1990s. So among folks that were poor at least once over that 3-year period, we find in the United States it's 23.5%. There's only 2 countries that have a higher poverty rate than the United States using this measure. One is Finland and one is Portugal. And I put those in red here, which is a little bit hard to see, but they are red. And then I put in orange the folks that are relatively close to the United States in terms of poverty over this 3-year period, and that would be Germany, Italy, the UK, and Spain. But what is really interesting is that when you look at this next column, the share of those folks that were actually poor for all 3 years, and the share of Americans who were poor for the full 3 years, not moving up at all, was much higher than in any other of these OECD countries. At 9.5%. So nearly 1 in 10 Americans who's poor will stay in poverty for 3 years. It's not just, almost a quarter are poor at some point over this 3-year period, but 1 in 10 are staying there for the full 3 years, which is much higher, almost double almost all of these other countries. The next closest ones are Portugal and Finland, coming in at 7.8 and 6.5% respectively. So that just gives you a sense of what this declining economic mobility for families overall has meant in terms of folks at the bottom being able to work their way out of poverty. The next slide I want to show looks at the rate of folks exiting poverty in the United States. And again, the United States is just completely off the charts in comparison to other countries. The share of folks, the yearly rate, so this is let's look at all the people in poverty. So if we were to pretend that everyone here in the room was in poverty, the rate of folks who are actually exiting that state and moving above poverty in any year over this 3-year period was a little bit less than a third in the United States, 29.5%. Whereas the next closest country is Canada at 36.4%, and other countries such as Denmark coming in at 60.4%. Meaning that in Denmark, nearly 2/3 of the folks that are in poverty step out of it within a year. Whereas in the United States, only about a third step out of poverty on an annual basis. So, which is another way. So the charts that I've showed you sort of on the previous end are looking at relative mobility. How well are folks doing relative to other people? Are they moving up the income distribution? This is sort of looking at how many folks are actually staying in this state at the bottom, unable to work their way out. And the United States is much higher than any other of these OECD countries. Now, I put a table in the handout if folks are interested. I'm not going to show it up here because it's far too small, but I wanted to talk for a few minutes now near the end here of the talk about why, right? So why is it, what happened to Horatio? Why is it that economic mobility in the United States has been decreasing? And why is it that folks are finding it more and more difficult to move their way out of poverty, sort of find economic mobility at the bottom end? And I want to start with that second question. When you compare the United States to other countries, a big part of the reason why folks find it much more difficult to move out of poverty has to do with the ways that our social policy does not support poor families and does not do the kinds of things that would help lift them out of poverty, especially as compared to policies in other countries. And so the table 7 that is in the handout, which again I'm not going to put up because it's very small, but if you have questions we can talk about it later or at another moment in time. But that gives some analysis as to what kinds of factors help families move up or hinder their movement up here in the United States. And a big part of it does have to do with the broadness of the social safety net, and in particular whether or not the safety net is supporting single mothers, single parents. So to sort of step back to the gender issue, a lot of the issues around poverty and why families are unable to move up is because the United States has such a high ratio, a high level of single mothers who are living in poverty and a lack of an adequate social safety net to move them above poverty. Although we do have some programs that help people at the bottom, they very often don't get folks to even our poverty threshold, let alone a 50% of median income threshold, or help those kinds of moms make it in the labor market. Most of them would be ineligible for any paid sick leave. About 2/3 of working Americans do not have access to any paid sick leave if their child gets ill. Those numbers are higher among low-wage workers, especially women workers. Most of those women who are trying to work themselves out of poverty, if they have small children, would be ineligible for the Family and Medical Leave Act, which provides unpaid leave. Many of them would be ineligible for it because they hadn't been working long enough or because they aren't putting in enough hours on the job. The lack of attention to issues around pay equity and gender discrimination, which happen at the bottom end, but as well as the top, but we have not done very much to help those folks at the bottom. So all of those kinds of things are associated with the poverty numbers that I'm showing you, but they also, we can tie some of those to the broader lack of economic mobility for families overall. In both the talk that I gave last week and I know the talk that John gave a few weeks ago, we're talking about why the United States has seen this increase in income inequality and the associated lack of economic mobility. We look to the same kinds of factors and look to the cumulative effects that these kinds of factors have had over time. In particular, we trace a lot of the greater inequities in the labor market to the lack of bargaining power on that workers have vis-a-vis employers. As unions have declined, as we've seen deregulation, the declining value of the minimum wage, and sort of the shredding of the social safety net more generally, which has been one could argue both a cause and an effect of declining power on the part of workers, are also all implicated in the lack of economic mobility. One thing that I've done quite a bit of work on, and we just released a paper about a month ago that is related to this, is the issue of student loan debt, which has to do with, of course, college, of course, is critical for economic mobility. Whether or not young people are able to go to college, afford school, and sort of get off on a step in life that allows them to move up and to perhaps do better than their parents did, or hopefully at least do as well. As we've seen college costs rise phenomenally, we've seen students taking on more and more debt. And one of the really sad things about that is that while many parents are able to help students pay off their debt after they graduate, students who start off in the bottom end of the income distribution, the bottom on up to the middle, are much less likely to have parental support to help them pay off their loans. And they're just as likely to take on loans. They're more likely than higher income kids to take on loans, and they take on about as much as higher income kids do. So this issue of the kinds of social supports that we have for workers, and in particular how we finance education and whether or not we give students aid in the form of grants versus loans, is of course implicated in the kinds of lifetime patterns that people have. So just to kind of try to bring mobility and the lack of social policies that favor workers and their families are intricately linked. I've included in the handouts a list of all the references that I cited and things for further reading. Some of them are quite dry, but I think that it's a much more complicated topic than I had covered last week, and I just wanted to make sure that folks were sort of armed with the kinds of research that they needed to be able to talk about this issue. And I shouldn't slam on the podium, and I've ended on time this time. So there we go.